A scream shattered the dawn in Blue Hollow. A wild bobcat, trapped and bleeding, fighting for its life in the freezing mist. 65-year-old Maggie West had every reason to walk away, but something stronger pulled her through the thorns. Her act of courage didn't just save a wild creature, it cracked open old wounds, drew a lonely town together, and set off a story that would break your heart, then show you how to heal. Before we dive in, I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe one act of kindness can change a life, or a whole town, please like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss another true story of wild hope and healing. The first rays of dawn barely touched the tangled woods surrounding Blue Hollow, turning the mist to silver as it drifted over the tangled roots and fallen branches. Maggie West moved carefully through the hush, her boots sinking into damp earth. At 65, Maggie had long since traded sleep for habit. Her mornings began before the robins and lasted long after the last coyote's call. She lived alone now, tucked away in her faded cabin at the edge of the wild, with only the old golden retriever, Charlie, for steady company. This morning felt heavier than most. Maybe it was the fog clinging to the trees or the ache in her bones, a memory of winters past and losses that still shadowed her steps. She paused on the porch, mug warming her hands, and let her gaze sweep the woods. Somewhere in the mist, a jay shrieked. Charlie's ears perked up, and his muzzle lifted to the wind, catching a scent Maggie couldn't yet sense. "Come on, old boy," she murmured. Charlie padded beside her as they slipped down the path, following a line of wild raspberry canes Maggie had learned to trust for signs of deer or fox. They moved in quiet companionship, sharing a language of small looks and soft sighs. But this morning, Charlie's hackles rose suddenly, and he gave a low, warning growl. Maggie stopped. Something was different. She could feel it, a subtle wrongness under the song of the forest, a tension that set her heart tapping an anxious rhythm. She listened, every sense stretching wide. Then she heard it, a muffled yowl, sharp and desperate, rising from deeper in the brush. Not a dog, not a fox, but something raw, wild, and hurt. Maggie's heart lurched. She set her mug down on a mossy log and pushed through the undergrowth, Charlie forging ahead, his nose skimming the ground. The sound came again, more frantic now. Maggie forced her way through a thicket of brambles, the thorns snagging at her flannel shirt. Charlie darted ahead, then stopped, his body stiff, head turned. The yowl became a hiss. That's when Maggie saw the glint. A rusty metal trap, half buried in old leaves. Caught in its vicious jaws, struggling and wild-eyed, was a young bobcat. Its fur was mottled gold and gray, ruffled with terror and pain. Blood darkened its left hind leg where the trap's cruel teeth bit deep. Charlie barked, a warning. Maggie's breath caught. She'd seen animals caught in traps before, raccoons, rabbits, even a bear cub once, but never a bobcat. They were ghosts in these woods, seldom seen, mostly heard in yowls and whispers of paw prints at the creek's edge. The bobcat spat and thrashed, ears flat, claws slashing the air. Maggie felt a jolt of fear. This was a wild animal, not some lost house cat. But under the fear was something sharper. Outrage. Who would set a trap like this so close to her land? She looked around, but the woods kept their secrets. She took a careful step forward, hands outstretched. "Easy now! Easy!" The bobcat lunged, fangs bared. Maggie stopped, weighing her next move. Her mind flashed back to all the lonely mornings since Bill died. to the silence left by her daughter's absence, the echo of family in an empty house. She understood what it meant to be cornered by pain. "Stay," she whispered to Charlie. He circled, low to the ground, but didn't bark again. Maggie crouched, eyes never leaving the bobcats. She could see the panic flickering there, wild and desperate. The animal tried to drag itself away, but the trap held firm. Maggie fumbled for her multi-tool, hands trembling. The bobcat lashed out, catching her sleeve with one hooked claw, tearing the fabric. Maggie flinched, but didn't retreat. She spoke softly, her voice threading through the fear. "I'm not going to hurt you. You hear me? I'm here to help." Charlie whined, pacing a tight circle. Maggie ignored the blood beating on her forearm. Her focus narrowed to the mechanism of the trap. Old, rusty, stiff with years of neglect. The bobcat's leg was slick with blood, trembling. She pressed her foot on the trap's spring, using all her weight. The metal groaned, resisting, then snapped open. In a blur of fur and claws, the bobcat jerked free, tumbling sideways. For one heart-stopping moment, Maggie thought it would bolt, vanishing back into the mist. But the animal's injured leg buckled, and it crumpled in the leaves, panting, spent. Maggie could see it was just a juvenile, not yet full-grown, too thin to withstand another night in the cold. She stepped back, giving the animal space, hands open. "You're free, little one. Go on." The bobcat tried to stand, wobbled, and fell again. Maggie's heart clenched. Leaving it now would be a death sentence. She looked at Charlie. He met her gaze, wise and steady. "What do you think?" she whispered. "Take him home?" Charlie wagged his tail, just once, a slow, solemn agreement. Maggie wrapped her jacket around the trembling bobcat, moving with careful, practiced hands. The animal hissed, but was too weak to fight. Maggie could feel the life beating under its ribs, a wild, fierce hope refusing to die. As she carried the wounded creature back through the thinning mist, Charlie keeping close at her side, Maggie knew something had shifted. She'd reached out across the gulf between wild and tame, and in that moment, the loneliness of her own heart felt less sharp, less final. She didn't know if the bobcat would live, or what the coming days would bring, but she knew this. She wouldn't turn away. Not this time. Behind her, the woods held their breath, and the first sunlight broke through the fog, painting Blue Hollow in gold. Thunder rumbled low and distant as Maggie stumbled through the front door, clutching the bundle of her old jacket, Rowan the bobcat trembling inside it. Charlie rushed ahead, nails scraping across the wood floor, glancing back as if urging Maggie to hurry. The storm outside pressed against the windows, wind howling, rain beating in frantic bursts. Maggie set the bobcat down on her kitchen table, her hands slick with blood and rainwater. The animal's breath came in short, harsh rasps, sides heaving, golden eyes glazed with shock and pain. For a moment, Maggie froze, overwhelmed by the sight. The raw wound on Rowan's leg looked worse in the harsh kitchen light. Deep, torn, already swelling. Maggie's own heart pounded, old fears trying to claw their way to the surface. She shook herself. Okay. You're here. You're safe now." She grabbed a clean towel, wrapping it tight around Rowan's hind leg, feeling the sticky warmth of blood seeping through the fabric. Charlie hovered at her elbow, eyes wide, ears flat with worry. Outside, lightning forked across the sky, illuminating the small, crowded kitchen. Maggie rummaged through her ancient medicine cabinet, hands unsteady as she gathered what little she had. Antiseptic, bandages, a rusted pair of scissors. She'd patched up wounded animals before, Stray cats, a barn owl with a broken wing, but never something as wild or dangerous as this. She thought of calling the local vet, but it was miles away, and the storm had knocked out the phone line hours ago. She worked by instinct, recalling lessons learned decades ago when her late husband, Bill, had taught her how to stitch up a torn hunting dog after a run-in with barbed wire. "It's just flesh and patience," Bill had said, steady as stone. Maggie swallowed hard, blinking away the memory. "You got this, Magpie," she whispered, the old nickname tasting bittersweet on her tongue. Rowan hissed as she cleaned the wound, trying to pull away, claws scrabbling against the table. Maggie kept talking, her words soft and constant, hoping the sound of her voice would soothe. "I know it hurts. Just a little longer. We're gonna get you fixed up, little guy." The rain lashed the windows harder. Maggie glanced up, heart jolting at every flash of lightning. Each time the thunder cracked, Rowan flinched violently, his eyes wild with terror. Maggie understood that fear all too well, the fear of storms, of pain, of being helpless and alone. She remembered the day she'd lost Bill, how the hospital room had filled with the electric silence of waiting, of hope dying by inches. She stitched Rowan's leg as gently as she could, fingers working steady despite the shaking. Blood stained the towel, but gradually the flow slowed, and the Bobcat's breathing eased. Charlie pressed his head to Maggie's knee, a silent anchor in the chaos. Maggie paused, laying her palm against the animal's side, feeling the trembling life there, the thrum of a wild heart refusing to quit. Night deepened. The storm raged on. Maggie found herself drifting into memories. Her daughter, Julie, storming out years ago after another argument about the farm, about the endless solitude Maggie seemed to choose over family. The kitchen felt emptier than ever, the years of loss pressing in on her. Yet here she was, fighting for the life of a creature no one else would care about. A fierce, irrational hope bloomed inside her. She made a nest of blankets by the stove, coaxing Rowan onto the softness. The Bobcat sagged, exhaustion claiming him, but his golden eyes never left Maggie's. In that gaze, she saw not just fear, but a spark of something else. Trust, or at least the fragile beginnings of it. The hours crawled. Maggie dozed in a chair, Charlie curled at her feet, both waking with every whimper from Rowan. At one point, the power flickered, plunging the house into darkness. Maggie lit an old oil lamp, bathing the kitchen in honey-colored glow. Rainwater seeped under the door, puddling at her boots, but Maggie ignored it, focused only on the shallow rise and fall of Rowan's chest. Around midnight, Rowan began to shiver violently, a fever burning in his small body. Maggie rummaged for her last antibiotic tablets, crushing one and mixing it into a saucer of water. She wasn't sure if Rowan would drink, but to her relief, the Bobcat lapped weakly, his tongue barely visible. As the hours passed, Maggie sang under her breath, old lullabies, fragments of hymns she'd almost forgotten. She watched Rowan's every breath, flinched at every cough or twitch. The storm seemed endless, the world outside lost to darkness and howling wind. In the small hours, Maggie's thoughts turned again to Julie. She wondered if her daughter was somewhere safe tonight, warm and dry, or if she too was haunted by storms and memories. Maggie wanted to reach out, to bridge the years of silence, but didn't know how. All she could do was offer her care, her stubborn love, to the small life struggling beside her. Finally, just before dawn, Rowan's fever broke. His breathing slowed, steadied. Maggie sat back, tears prickling her eyes as relief flooded through her. She reached down, stroking his fur gently. Charlie gave a soft whine, nudging her hand as if to say, "We did it!" Maggie managed a tired smile. "Yeah, buddy, we did." Outside, the storm began to fade. Rain softened to a whisper, thunder retreating into the hills. Light crept back into the world, gentle and tentative. Maggie watched Rowan, asleep at last, chest rising and falling in a fragile rhythm. She felt the weight of the night lift from her shoulders. For the first time in years, hope flickered in Maggie's heart. Not a loud hope, but a quiet, stubborn one. Against all odds, Rowan had survived the night. Maybe, just maybe, that meant they all could. Maggie closed her eyes, letting exhaustion take her, the warmth of Charlie and the wild promise of the little Bobcat at her side. Outside, Blue Hollow waited, changed by a single act of courage, a night of storm, fear, and the fragile beginnings of trust. Winter pressed down on Blue Hollow, relentless and silent. The wind bit through the trees, and the world shrank to the glow of Maggie's kitchen window, the only light for miles. Snowdrifts rose against the cabin walls, muffling every sound but the creak of old wood and the quiet, steady breathing of those inside. Maggie moved through her days bundled in thick sweaters and woolen socks, her hair pulled back in a loose gray braid, her face etched with lines carved by loss and time. After that terrible night, Rowan had lain still for days, his eyes fever-bright and wary. Every morning, Maggie knelt beside his blanket nest, checking his wound and coaxing him to drink water or lap a bit of broth from a shallow dish. She spoke to him in a soft voice, telling him about the snow outside, about the deer trails she used to walk with Bill, about Charlie's ridiculous habit of burying bones in the woodpile. Sometimes Rowan just blinked at her, but other times his ears twitched, and Maggie liked to think he was listening. Charlie kept a gentle vigil, always a few feet away, never pushing but always present. The golden retriever seemed to understand that Rowan wasn't just another animal. They were both outsiders in Maggie's quiet world, survivors clinging to whatever comfort they could find. On the coldest nights, Charlie would settle near Rowan's nest, sharing his warmth without a sound. Weeks passed in a rhythm of care. Outside, storms battered the roof and painted frost flowers across the glass. Inside, Maggie's life became small and close. A pot simmering on the stove, a fire crackling in the hearth, her breath misting as she knelt to check Rowan's bandages. She kept a journal, filling its pages with her hopes and fears, the things she couldn't say to anyone else. Sometimes she wrote to Bill, sometimes to Julie, the daughter she hadn't spoken to in years. Always she wrote about Rowan, the wild thing with the golden eyes who refused to give up. The days blurred together, and Maggie found herself thinking about her life in a way she hadn't dared to for years. She remembered the first winter after Bill's death, when the silence in the cabin had been too much to bear. She'd stopped playing music, stopped inviting neighbors for coffee, let the world recede behind a wall of grief. Even when Julie had called, Maggie had kept the conversations short, never quite finding the words to bridge the distance between them. Now, with Rowan fighting for his life, Maggie felt those old walls begin to crack. She'd risked her own safety to save him, and in the doing, she'd allowed herself to hope again, just a little. She saw it in the way she watched over Rowan, in the gentle way she spoke to Charlie, even in the quiet pride she felt each time Rowan managed a few shaky steps around the kitchen. The Bobcat's skittishness reminded her of her own, how she'd spent years keeping everyone at arm's length, afraid to risk being hurt again. Rowan's progress was slow. Some days he seemed stronger, prowling along the kitchen wall or curling up in the patch of sunlight that stretched across the floor. Other days, he hid beneath the old armchair, shivering when the wind howled. Maggie never forced him, never scolded. She remembered how it felt to be pushed too hard, too soon. Instead, she let him come to her, offering small comforts: warm milk, a gentle touch, the sound of her voice weaving through the hush. One afternoon, Maggie watched as Rowan limped to the window and pressed his nose against the cold glass. Outside, snowflakes drifted like tiny feathers, the woods beyond lost in white silence. Charlie padded over, sitting quietly beside Rowan, his tail thumping softly. Maggie's heart caught at the sight, the wild thing and the loyal dog sharing a moment of peace. She pulled her journal from the shelf and sat at the table watching them. Her hand moved across the page, the words coming easier than they had in years. "He's starting to trust us, Bill," she wrote. "Maybe I'm starting to trust myself again, too." She closed her eyes, letting the warmth of the fire and the soft sounds of the animals lull her. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel quite so alone. Winter lingered, refusing to loosen its grip. Food grew scarce, and Maggie rationed her supplies, stretching canned beans and root vegetables, baking dense loaves of bread to share. She wondered if Julie would be proud of her, wondered if her daughter ever thought of her at all. The ache of that distance was sharp, but Maggie tried to fill it with care, with the ritual of tending Rowan's wound, with the simple joy of seeing him take a little more food each day. As the days grew longer, Rowan began to change. His coat thickened, his eyes grew brighter, and he started to play. Batting at a ball of yarn Maggie rolled across the floor, or stalking Charlie's swishing tail with careful, calculated steps. Maggie laughed more than she had in years, her voice echoing through the cabin, startling even herself. One evening, as dusk settled over Blue Hollow, Rowan approached Maggie where she sat by the fire. He paused, uncertain, then butted his head gently against her hand. Maggie froze, then stroked his head with trembling fingers. Charlie wagged his tail, and for a moment, the little cabin was filled with a rare, golden peace. Maggie knew it couldn't last forever. Rowan was a wild thing, and the world outside was calling him back. But for now, as snow fell in gentle drifts and the fire burned low, she allowed herself to hope. She let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, she could let someone, or something, in again. And in that hope, spring began to whisper on the cold air, promising that the long winter of waiting would, in time, come to an end. Spring crept into Blue Hollow slowly, as if the world itself were waking from a long, troubled dream. The snow melted away in patches, revealing the earth underneath, soggy, brown, and stubbornly alive. Buds pushed from the gray arms of the dogwood trees, and robins flitted through the brush, calling to each other in bright, insistent voices. The first sunlight felt like a promise, and the scent of thawing soil seeped into the cabin through every crack. Inside, Maggie watched Rowan transform before her eyes. The young bobcat grew stronger every day. The wound on his leg nearly vanished now beneath a new patch of golden fur. His body moved with an effortless, feline grace, muscle and bone realigning into a creature meant for running, climbing, and hunting. Yet Maggie saw more than just the return of physical strength. She saw the wild awakening inside him, burning brighter with each sunrise. She'd built Rowan a special run out back, using old lumber and chicken wire, hammering the posts into the soft spring earth with a determination she didn't know she still possessed. It wasn't perfect, but it gave him space to move, to remember the world beyond four walls. Rowan prowled its edges, nose twitching, ears flicking at every new sound. The rush of wind, the chatter of squirrels, the distant cry of a hawk. Maggie spent hours sitting outside, wrapped in a faded quilt, watching him explore. Sometimes Charlie lay beside her, eyes tracking Rowan's every move. Other times, Maggie watched alone, her heart tangled in a web of longing and dread. She'd grown used to Rowan's presence, to the strange comfort of his wild company. But she knew what was coming. Every day that Rowan grew stronger was a day closer to the moment she would have to let him go. One afternoon, as Maggie sat with a mug of tea warming her hands, Rowan leapt onto a low branch she'd added to the run. He clung there, balancing effortlessly, then leapt down in a blur of movement. The sight made Maggie smile, but the ache in her chest deepened. It was clear. Rowan wasn't meant for a life behind fences. Later that evening, as the sun bled out behind the hills, Maggie heard the crunch of tires on gravel. She looked up, heart stuttering, as a white pickup rolled into the driveway. Two wildlife officers stepped out, one young and eager, the other older, face weathered by sun and wind. Maggie recognized them from town, the same men who sometimes stopped by the market to talk about bear sightings or lost hikers. They approached the porch, hats in hand, and Maggie met them with polite wariness. Charlie lingered close, sensing her unease. "Mrs. West," the older officer began, voice gentle, "we've heard about the Bobcat. Folks say you've been taking care of him all winter." Maggie nodded, swallowing her pride. "He would have died otherwise. I couldn't just leave him." The younger officer looked past her toward the run, where Rowan crouched, half hidden in the shadows. "It's not exactly legal to keep wild animals, ma'am. But, circumstances being what they are, we wanted to see how he's doing." Maggie felt the weight of judgment in their eyes, but also a flicker of understanding. She led them out back, explaining Rowan's injury, how she'd nursed him through the worst of the winter. The older officer listened, nodding, while the younger took notes, glancing up every now and then to watch Rowan stalk the perimeter. "He's nearly ready," Maggie said, her voice rough. "He's strong. He's got all his wildness back." The officers exchanged a glance. "If he can survive on his own, we'd rather see him released than spend his life in captivity," the older man said. "But it won't be easy. He'll need to show he can hunt, avoid people, fend for himself. We'll have to monitor him for a while." Maggie's relief was tempered by fear. She wanted Rowan free, but the idea of letting him face the world alone was almost unbearable. She forced herself to nod. "Just tell me what to do." After the officers left, Maggie sat on the porch steps, the old boards creaking beneath her. Charlie pressed close, laying his head in her lap. Maggie stroked his fur, lost in thought. She knew what she had to do, but it didn't make it any easier. To love something wild was to accept, from the very beginning, that one day it would leave. That night, Maggie couldn't sleep. She wandered the cabin, listening to the sounds of spring outside, the peepers calling from the creek, the wind sighing through budding branches. She poured herself a whiskey and sat at the table, staring at the journal she'd filled through the long winter. She wrote a single line. "How do you say goodbye to something that healed your heart just by being wild?" The days that followed were both beautiful and excruciating. Rowan's instincts sharpened. He stalked birds through the mesh of his run, climbed and leapt, disappearing into every shadow. Maggie watched him hunt moths at dusk, eyes shining, and felt a mix of pride and grief. Sometimes she spoke aloud, as if to Bill or Julie, confessing her fear. "I'm not ready," she whispered one morning, as Rowan pounced at a leaf, the muscles in his shoulders rippling. "But I guess that's the point, isn't it?" She reached out to the wildlife officers, agreeing to let them help with Rowan's transition. They brought her reading material, instructions on rewilding, advice on minimizing human contact. It was a delicate balance, giving Rowan what he needed, even as it meant withdrawing her affection, pulling back just when trust had finally taken root. As April gave way to May, the woods burst into green. Rowan prowled the run like a king, golden and fierce. Maggie sat with Charlie under the flowering dogwood, watching the wild things she loved learn to live without her. Every evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Maggie whispered a silent promise to the bobcat and to herself. When the time came, she would be brave. She would let Rowan go. And in that bittersweet waiting, Maggie realized that the truest kind of love was never about possession. It was about giving another creature the freedom to be itself, no matter how much it hurt. Word travels fast in a small town, and soon Blue Hollow was buzzing with talk of Maggie West and her wild bobcat. At first it was little more than curiosity, neighbors whispering in the aisles of Miller's grocery, their voices lowered over bins of potatoes and apples. "You heard about Maggie and that wildcat? I saw her building a cage in the yard. Should we be worried about the kids?" The story spread, reshaped by every telling. One chilly Saturday, Maggie went into town for supplies. Heads turned as she passed. Some folks offered stiff nods, others eyed her with suspicion. At the feed store, Mrs. Grady, her hair always wound tight as a question, cornered Maggie by the sacks of dog kibble. "I heard you're harboring a dangerous animal, Maggie. Don't you think that's a bit reckless at your age?" Maggie met her gaze, the stubborn line of her jaw holding firm. "He's not dangerous, Gladys. He was hurt. I did what anyone would do." But even as she said it, Maggie knew not everyone agreed. The children were a different story. They gathered at the edge of her yard in the afternoons, faces pressed to the fence, eyes wide with fascination. Some brought offerings, drawings of bobcats and wildflowers, crusts of bread, or half-melted candies. Rowan ignored them, prowling the far side of his run, but the kids whispered about the wildcat lady with a mix of awe and envy. One day, a soft knock rattled Maggie's screen door. When she answered, she found Mrs. Ellis, the elementary school teacher, standing on the stoop with her arms full of construction paper and poster boards. "I hope I'm not intruding, Maggie, but the kids are obsessed. We're doing a project on local wildlife. I was wondering if you'd be willing to speak to the class. Or, well, maybe let them see Rowan from a safe distance." Maggie hesitated, old shyness tugging at her. She'd spent years keeping to herself, but the hope in Mrs. Ellis's eyes and the memory of her own daughter's childhood curiosity softened her heart. "All right, but only if the wildlife officers say it's okay." The following week, a caravan of second graders filed up her driveway, chaperoned by Mrs. Ellis and two nervous parents. Maggie showed them Rowan from across the yard, explaining how he'd been hurt and why he needed to return to the wild. The children listened with rapt attention, their faces shining with empathy and wonder. "Does he remember you saved him?" one little boy asked, clutching a crayon drawing. Maggie smiled. "Maybe, but it's more important that he remembers how to be wild." Their questions poured out. What does he eat? Does he purr? Will he ever come back? Maggie answered each as best she could, careful not to promise more than she knew. When the class left, Mrs. Ellis squeezed her hand. "You're doing something special, Maggie. The kids will remember this." Not everyone was supportive. A few neighbors grumbled about safety, and rumors flew that animal control would come take Rowan away. Maggie found an anonymous note pinned to her fence one morning. "That cat belongs in the woods, not here." Her heart thudded with anxiety. The thought of losing Rowan to captivity, of all her work and hope erased by a single official's decision, kept her awake at night. But Maggie refused to back down. She met with the wildlife officers again, agreeing to every precaution. No more direct handling, minimal contact, regular reports on Rowan's progress. She signed forms, answered questions, and allowed her property to be inspected. She endured town meetings where her motives were debated, sometimes harshly, sometimes with unexpected support. One evening, as Maggie walked Rowan's run, she was surprised to find a group of teenagers at her fence. She braced herself for teasing or trouble, but instead, the tallest boy spoke first. "We heard what you're doing. That's pretty cool, ma'am. My little sister can't stop talking about the Bobcat." Another girl chimed in. "If you need help building stuff for him, we know our way around tools. My dad's got extra lumber." Maggie felt a flush of gratitude, her faith in people rekindled by their kindness. She accepted their offer, and that weekend, the teens showed up with hammers and planks. Together, they expanded Rowan's run, building platforms and climbing structures. As they worked, Maggie told them about animal tracks and how to spot deer paths, her knowledge flowing out naturally for the first time in years. Gradually, the town's attitude shifted. The children's drawings multiplied on her porch, and someone left a sack of fresh eggs with a note. "For the Wildcat lady. Keep up the good work." Maggie found herself invited to community events she'd long avoided. A bake sale, a spring planting day. At each, people approached her, some offering advice, others simply sharing stories of wildlife encounters from their own childhoods. But with every new connection, Maggie felt the looming reality. Soon, she would have to prove Rowan was ready. The wildlife officers set a date for a supervised trial, a series of tests to determine if Rowan could hunt, evade humans, and survive on his own. If he failed, he'd be taken to a sanctuary, confined to a pen for the rest of his life. The night before the trial, Maggie barely slept. She sat with Charlie on the porch, listening to the peepers in the creek, heart twisting with hope and dread. She remembered every moment of Rowan's recovery, the fevered nights, the tentative steps, the first spark of trust. She thought of the townspeople, the children, the teens who had helped build Rowan's world bigger. She felt the weight of their faith in her and in Rowan. She whispered into the darkness, "You can do this, wild boy. I believe in you." As dawn crept over Blue Hollow, Maggie watched Rowan pace the run, golden eyes alive with the fire of his ancestors. Whether he succeeded or not, she knew he'd already changed her, and the town, forever. The morning sun shimmered across the Blue Hollow treetops, painting everything in hopeful gold. Maggie felt the nerves bundle tight in her chest as she loaded the battered pickup, hands trembling as she checked and rechecked every last item: cans of sardines, bandages, a thermos of coffee, Charlie's leash. Rowan watched from his carrier, silent and watchful, his eyes unreadable. He'd grown into his strength, his coat glossy and thick, the last traces of his injury long vanished beneath rippling muscle. Yet something in the set of his shoulders told Maggie he was aware that everything was about to change. By mid-morning, the wildlife officers arrived, their truck packed with supplies for the new rewilding enclosure at the forest's edge. Maggie followed in her pickup, Charlie riding shotgun with his chin on the dash. As the convoy wound down the old logging road, deeper into the woods than Maggie had gone in years. The forest was waking from its long winter sleep. Dogwood blossoms dotted the understory, and redbuds glowed in patches of sunlight. Birds flitted through the trees, calling their secrets to the wind. The rewilding enclosure sat at the meeting of two creeks, surrounded by tall fencing and a locked gate. Inside was a half-acre of tangled brush, saplings, and fallen logs, a small kingdom of wildness, built to prepare Rowan for life on his own. Maggie's heart ached at the sight. It was a prison, in a way, but it was also hope. A last chance for Rowan to reclaim what had almost been stolen from him. The wildlife officers carried Rowan's carrier into the enclosure, setting it near a pile of rocks. Maggie knelt, opening the door. For a moment, Rowan hesitated, his ears flat and his muscles coiled. Then, in a blur, he darted out, hugging the fence, moving low and fast through the grass. Charlie barked once, tail wagging, as if in encouragement. Maggie watched, her hands twisting in her lap, as Rowan explored his new world. He moved with careful purpose, testing each scent, every noise. She could see his instincts sharpening, how he crouched before leaping onto a fallen log, how he stalked the fluttering shadows of birds overhead. Every day, Maggie and Charlie visited the enclosure, bringing food at first, then gradually reducing their presence, forcing Rowan to rely on his own skills. The process was agonizing. Maggie had to resist the urge to call out, to offer comfort. The wildlife officers explained the rules clearly. Minimal human contact, no coddling, no direct feeding. She watched Rowan learn to catch mice and frogs, watched him vanish into the tall grass and emerge with the wild gleam of triumph in his eyes. Sometimes, Maggie caught him watching her from a distance, and for a heartbeat, she thought she saw a flash of recognition, a silent thank you, or maybe just a question. Then Rowan would turn away, disappearing into the shadows. Charlie struggled too. For weeks he sat at the fence, whining softly, searching for the friend he'd grown to love. Maggie knelt beside him, her voice gentle. "He has to learn, boy, just like we all do." She stroked Charlie's head, blinking back tears. She understood his longing. Rowan was a piece of both their hearts, and now he was slipping away. The wildlife officers monitored Rowan's progress with cameras and notepads, charting every success. They watched as he learned to avoid their scent, to vanish at the approach of strangers. Maggie took comfort in each small victory, but it felt like swallowing broken glass. Pride and pain tangled so tightly she couldn't separate one from the other. One afternoon, a heavy rain swept across Blue Hollow, flattening the grass in the enclosure. Maggie huddled under the lean-to by the gate. Charlie pressed close for warmth. They watched Rowan as he navigated the storm, his coat plastered to his sides, his eyes bright and unafraid. He found shelter beneath a pile of brush, curled tight and waiting out the worst of it. Maggie felt a fierce surge of pride. He was learning, truly learning, to be wild again. Still, there were setbacks. Rowan lost weight the first week, struggling to adjust to hunting in a contained space. Maggie watched, powerless, as he limped for a day after tangling with a bramble, or when he spent long hours huddled and listless after a cold night. Each stumble was a test, for Rowan, but also for Maggie. She had to hold herself back, to let him fail and recover without interference. Sometimes, late at night, Maggie lay awake, haunted by doubts. Had she done enough? Was she abandoning him, or giving him the only real gift she could? She found herself writing long letters in her journal, letters to Bill, to Julie, to Rowan himself. She wrote about the ache of letting go, the terror of loving something that could never truly belong to her. One morning, as the sun rose pink over the pines, Rowan made his first clean kill, a field mouse dispatched with quick, silent efficiency. The officers celebrated quietly, nodding in approval. Maggie felt her throat tighten with relief. Step by step, Rowan was proving himself. Each week, the visits grew shorter. Maggie lingered by the gate, sometimes catching a glimpse of Rowan in the underbrush, sometimes leaving without seeing him at all. The less he sought her out, the more she knew he was ready. The knowledge broke her heart and mended it at the same time. By the end of the month, the officers declared Rowan fit for release. Maggie watched as they prepared to open the gate for good, her hands trembling with anticipation and dread. She knelt by Charlie, whispering, "This is it, boy. This is what we hoped for." As the sun climbed higher, Rowan paced the far side of the enclosure, wild and wary, his golden eyes bright with the fire of freedom. Maggie knew he wouldn't look back. Not really. But she also knew, deep down, that she'd never truly lose him. Not as long as wildness lived in the woods, and hope burned in her heart. Summer in Blue Hollow arrived with thunder. Hot, heavy air pressing down, the forest bristling with the scent of rain. Maggie felt it before the first clouds appeared, her bones aching, an old warning from years of watching the sky for storms. Charlie seemed anxious too, pacing the porch and whining as the air grew electric. The weather radio droned from the kitchen, forecasting severe storms and flash floods overnight. But Maggie's mind wasn't on the radio. It was on Rowan. The wildlife officers had agreed. Rowan's final test would come soon. He'd passed every hurdle, learning to hunt and hide, to fear humans and survive the wild. Maggie had watched his world shrink and expand, each day a lesson in loss and hope. Now, as the wind picked up and the sky darkened to a bruise, she couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to change. That evening, the officers arrived for their last check-in. "Storm's rolling in, Mrs. West," the older one warned, glancing at the clouds boiling above the treetops. "Rowan should be fine, but we'll swing back in the morning just in case. Let him ride it out. No interference unless he's in real danger." Maggie nodded, biting back her worry. She'd seen wild animals weather storms before, but Rowan wasn't just any wild animal, not to her. She sat on the porch, coffee cooling in her hands, watching the trees whip and bow. Somewhere in the enclosure, Rowan moved in and out of shadows, wary but composed, his golden eyes catching every flicker of lightning. By nightfall, the rain came in sheets, drumming against the roof and windows, drowning out even the frogs' chorus. Maggie's thoughts spiraled, memories of other storms, of nights waiting for Bill to come home, of listening for her daughter's voice in the wind. Charlie whined at the door, restless, refusing to settle. Maggie wrapped herself in her raincoat and grabbed a flashlight. "Just a quick check, Charlie. Stay close." The wind nearly tore the door from her hands. She pushed out into the storm, boots sinking into mud, flashlight beam trembling as she crossed the yard toward the enclosure. Branches whipped overhead, thunder rattled the ground, and rain blinded her. Maggie stumbled along the fence, calling softly, "Rowan! Rowan, boy, where are you?" But the only answer was the howl of the wind. She swept the beam across the brush, catching glimpses of movement, shadows darting, leaves thrashing. Suddenly a high, thin yowl pierced the night, sharp with fear and pain. Maggie's heart nearly stopped. She shoved the gate open and plunged inside, Charlie at her heels. The world was chaos. Wind tearing at her hair, rain seeping through every layer of clothing. The yowl came again, desperate, closer now. Maggie fought through tangled branches, heart pounding, searching for any sign of Rowan. Her flashlight flickered over the ground, and there he was, tangled in a coil of old barbed wire near the far fence, his leg bleeding, eyes wide with terror. "Oh God, Rowan!" Maggie dropped to her knees, hands shaking as she reached for him. Charlie hovered, whining, ears flat to his skull. Rowan twisted, snarling, trapped and frantic. Maggie saw the wire wrapped tight around his leg, cutting into flesh. The sight sent her mind spinning back, Bill's hand caught in a winch. Julie's childhood tears over a rabbit snared in a neighbor's fence. The same helplessness, the same wild, impossible hope. She forced herself to breathe. "Easy, Rowan. Easy now. I'm here." She dug her multi-tool from her pocket, fingers slipping on the wet metal, and began working the wire loose. Rowan fought at first, teeth snapping in panic, but Maggie murmured soothing nonsense, her voice threading through the roar of the storm. Time blurred. Her knees ached in the mud, rain pooling at her feet, flashlight threatening to die. She could feel Rowan trembling, feel Charlie's steady warmth pressed against her side. The wire finally came free with a snap, and Maggie hauled Rowan into her lap, cradling his shaking body against her chest. His leg was bleeding badly, but the wound was shallow compared to the old injury. Maggie wrapped it quickly with a strip torn from her shirt, then checked him over. No broken bones, no deep gashes. Relief warred with exhaustion. She staggered back to the gate, Charlie leading the way, Rowan heavy in her arms. The wind tried to push her down, but she gritted her teeth and kept moving, every step an act of will. The cabin was a distant glow through the storm, a promise of safety. Inside, Maggie set Rowan by the stove, rubbing him dry with a towel, checking his breathing, whispering encouragement. Charlie circled, licking Rowan's face, whining with concern. Rowan huddled, exhausted, but alive. Maggie sat beside him, shaking, her hands bloodied and raw. "You did it, wild boy," she whispered. "You made it through." The power flickered, then held. The storm raged outside. But inside, the world shrank to warmth and steady breathing. Rowan slept, his head resting on Charlie's paw. Maggie sat awake, watching over them, heart pounding with fear, gratitude, and something like pride. She knew now, without doubt, that Rowan was ready for the wild, not because he'd survived alone, but because he'd fought, endured, and accepted help when he needed it most. When the storm finally broke, and pale sunlight crept through the curtains, Rowan was the first to rise. He limped to the window, peered out into the washed, clean world, and met Maggie's gaze with clear, fearless eyes. That morning, as the wildlife officers returned to inspect the enclosure, they found Maggie, Charlie, and Rowan on the porch, battered but unbroken. Maggie smiled through her exhaustion. She'd feared this test all along, but she understood now that it was never just Rowan being tested. It was her, too. Her courage to let go, her faith in wildness, her willingness to hope. As Rowan healed from his ordeal, Maggie knew the moment was close. The gate would soon open. The wild would call him home. She was ready. She had to be. After all, wildness, once trusted, finds its own way back. Not always in body, but always in spirit. The days after the storm passed in a hush, as if the whole world was holding its breath. The air in Blue Hollow felt scrubbed clean, the woods alive with birdsong and sunlight. Rowan's limp faded as quickly as the puddles on the gravel road, and Maggie watched him move through the enclosure, restless and radiant, every muscle humming with anticipation. His eyes shone, and there was a new confidence in his step, a knowledge that he belonged to something bigger than any fence. Maggie knew the time had come. Word of Rowan's survival and the harrowing storm rescue rippled through town, and soon neighbors, old friends, skeptical townsfolk, and children alike asked about the release. Some hoped to witness it. Others brought casseroles and cards, leaving them on Maggie's porch with scribbled notes. "Good luck, wild boy, and thank you, Maggie, for reminding us what matters." Maggie felt the weight of community expectations settle on her shoulders. She'd spent much of her life alone, content in the shadows. But now people looked to her with pride, as if Rowan's story belonged to all of them. It made the coming goodbye both easier and harder. The wildlife officers arrived early, quiet and efficient, their faces kind. They double-checked the paperwork and the plan, then offered Maggie a gentle nod. "It's your call, Mrs. West. You should be the one to open the gate." Maggie spent that morning in quiet preparation. She moved with care, packing away Rowan's old bedding, cleaning the enclosure one last time. Charlie sensed the shift. He followed her everywhere, nose nudging her hand, eyes full of worried understanding. Maggie leaned down and hugged him, pressing her cheek to his soft fur. "It's time, old friend," she whispered. "We did all we could." Just before noon, a small crowd gathered at the edge of the woods. Some were neighbors she'd known for decades. Others were children from Mrs. Ellis's class, clutching new drawings of Rowan, their faces shining with hope and excitement. A few teenagers stood in the back, their hands shoved in their pockets, but Maggie saw pride in their eyes, the same pride she felt in her heart. Rowan paced inside the enclosure, tail lashing, nostrils flaring as he drank in the smells and sounds of the living woods. Maggie entered slowly, her palms open. She didn't try to touch him, didn't call his name. Instead, she knelt by the gate, her voice steady but trembling at the edges. "You're ready, Rowan," she said. "Go on now. The world's waiting for you." She slid the bolt back and pushed the gate open, just wide enough for him to slip through. For a moment, Rowan hesitated, caught between the comfort of what he knew and the pull of what he was meant to be. The crowd was utterly silent, watching. Charlie sat beside Maggie, head high, tail thumping softly. Rowan crept to the threshold, nose twitching. He glanced back once, long enough for Maggie to see the wild in his eyes, and she fancied a flicker of gratitude or understanding. Then, with a single leap, he vanished into the green, silent and swift as a shadow. Maggie stood, her hands shaking, heart hammering in her chest. The woods absorbed Rowan without a sound, but to Maggie it felt as if the whole valley was singing, a song of freedom, of hope, of something lost and found all at once. There were tears in her eyes, but she didn't hide them. Around her, the crowd began to clap and cheer, some children shouting, "Run, Rowan, run!" The teenagers grinned, high-fiving each other. Even the wildlife officers smiled, their usual reserve softened by the moment. Mrs. Ellis wiped her eyes, hugging her daughter. "You did it, Maggie," she called. "You really did." Neighbors approached one by one, pressing her hand, thanking her for her courage. Maggie felt the warmth of their praise, but all she could think of was Rowan, out there in the wild, his future uncertain, but his spirit finally unbound. Charlie whined softly, searching the woods for any sign of his friend. Maggie knelt beside him, wrapping an arm around his neck. "He's gone, boy," she murmured. "But he'll never really leave us." Charlie sighed, resting his head on Maggie's knee, and together they watched the forest, waiting for the world to settle. That afternoon, Maggie wandered the edge of the woods, listening for the faintest sign of Rowan, a rustle in the brush, a paw print in the soft earth, a flash of gold between the trees. Each sound made her heart leap, but she knew better than to call out or search. Rowan belonged to the wild now, and she had to honor that truth, no matter how it hurt. Back at the cabin, Maggie made tea and sat on the porch, watching the sun slip behind the hills. She felt grief and pride braided together. Grief for the loss of her wild companion, pride for the strength they'd both discovered. In her journal, she wrote, "Letting go is the hardest thing I've ever done, but also the truest act of love I know. I hope he remembers us, not as captors, but as kin." As dusk deepened, Maggie heard children's laughter down by the creek, saw neighbors waving as they walked home. The town, once divided, had come together, if only for a moment, because of a single wild bobcat and the woman who dared to care. The forest was silent, holding its secrets. But Maggie knew, deep in her bones, that somewhere out there, Rowan was running free, and that was all she'd ever wanted for him. Autumn crept quietly into Blue Hollow, draping the hills in shades of rust and gold. The nights grew longer and the mornings colder, frost shimmering on the grass like spun silver. Maggie West moved slower these days, her steps careful as she crossed the porch to greet each new dawn. The ache in her joints was a gentle reminder that her body, like the seasons, was winding down. Charlie stayed close, never letting her out of his sight. The old retriever, grayer around the muzzle now, moved with a watchful tenderness, as if he sensed time was growing short. Maggie spent her days in a rhythm of simplicity, tending the wood stove, stirring pots of soup, wrapping herself in quilts on the porch while she watched the leaves drift down. Sometimes she read aloud from the battered stack of books Bill had left behind. Other times, she simply sat in silence, letting the cool air carry her thoughts wherever they needed to go. Blue Hollow was quieter now. Children had gone back to school, and the last of the summer visitors had packed away their tents. But Maggie was never truly alone. Neighbors stopped by with jars of preserves and baskets of apples, checking in on her, sharing news of the town. Some brought their children, who ran through her yard and begged for stories about Rowan. Maggie obliged, her voice steady as she recounted the tale of the wild bobcat who'd once called her cabin home. In every telling, she found new layers of meaning, new ways to explain what had changed in her and in everyone who'd witnessed Rowan's journey. But it was in the quiet, in the long hours between sunset and sleep, that Maggie felt the true weight of what she'd done. Some nights, she woke from dreams of wild forests and golden eyes, heart pounding with longing and loss. She missed Rowan fiercely, not as a pet or a possession, but as a living symbol of hope, of connection, of what it meant to let love shape you and then set you free. It was on such a night, in the waning days of October, that Maggie sat wrapped in a shawl on her porch, Charlie stretched at her feet. The trees burned with color, their leaves spinning down in the cool wind. Maggie watched the sun set, the sky a blaze of red and purple, and she felt a peaceful kind of sadness, a completeness she couldn't quite explain. Twilight deepened, and Maggie closed her eyes, letting the sounds of the hollow wash over her. The distant rush of the creek, the whisper of wind through the pines. Then, just as the first stars began to prick the sky, Charlie lifted his head, ears pricked. He let out a low, expectant whine. Maggie opened her eyes, her breath catching. At the edge of the woods, framed by falling leaves and golden light, stood Rowan. He was bigger now, powerful and unmistakably wild, his coat thick and glossy, his eyes bright with the intelligence of the untamed. For a long moment, he stood motionless, as if uncertain whether to come closer. Charlie stayed perfectly still, his tail sweeping the porch in a slow, steady rhythm. Maggie's heart filled with a complex mixture of grief and gratitude, awe and acceptance. She knew better than to call out, to move or make a sound. Instead, she simply waited, letting the moment unfold. Rowan stepped forward, silent as mist, until he stood beside the porch. He sat, regal and unhurried, his gaze meeting Maggie's with something deeper than recognition, an unspoken understanding. Charlie inched closer, lying quietly at Maggie's feet, the three of them forming a silent circle of memory and belonging. In Rowan's eyes, Maggie saw the whole story, the struggle and hope, the wildness and the care that had bound them together. She saw the reflection of her own life, a journey through loss, a refusal to give up, the courage it took to love again after heartbreak. The Bobcat's return was not a plea for help, nor a sign of weakness. It was a gift, an affirmation that letting go had not broken their bond, but had made it stronger, purer. Maggie's thoughts drifted to all the risks she had taken. The late-night rescue, the months of nursing Rowan back to health, the pain of preparing him for the wild and then watching him disappear. Every act of courage had hurt, but every risk had brought healing too. She understood now that the hardest part of loving, whether a person, a child, or a wild creature, was always the letting go. She remembered Bill's hands on hers, steady and sure, and the echo of Julie's laughter in the kitchen. She remembered the loneliness that had nearly swallowed her after Bill's death, the walls she'd built around her heart. Rowan had helped her break those walls down, not by needing her, but by teaching her the power of kinship that crossed all boundaries. That night, Rowan sat with Maggie until the last light faded from the sky. He did not ask for food or comfort. He did not linger out of weakness. He stayed because the bond between them was deeper than possession, because real love honors freedom, trusts in return, and asks nothing more than the chance to care, even knowing the cost. As Maggie drifted toward sleep, her head on Charlie's shoulder, she felt no regret, only peace and the faint, wild joy of knowing she had given everything she could. Rowan rose quietly, melting into the dark woods as the stars wheeled overhead. But Maggie knew he would never be lost to her. The wild always finds its way back, sometimes in body, always in spirit. In those final golden days, Maggie understood the true lesson of her journey, that the deepest bonds are forged not through holding on, but by giving each other room to become who we're meant to be. She smiled into the night, her heart full, her spirit free, knowing she had become part of something wild and lasting, kinship beyond words, beyond time. The winter that followed was gentler than most, as if the land itself remembered Maggie's kindness and wanted to ease her final season. Frost rimed the windows of the old cabin, and snow fell softly over Blue Hollow, blanketing the woods in a hush that seemed to pause time itself. Inside, the hearth glowed with the last embers of Maggie's life. She grew frail, her movements slow, but her spirit shone undiminished. She spent her days by the window or bundled on the porch, Charlie always beside her, eyes bright with steadfast love. Neighbors came more often, bringing soup and bread, filling the house with quiet conversation. Some just sat, content to share the peace Maggie carried, others eager to listen as she retold Rowan's story. Children from Mrs. Ellis's class would bring her new drawings of bobcats and wild woods, their bright crayons capturing the hope and courage Maggie had given them. Teens who once helped build Rowan's Run came to shovel the walk or stack wood, lingering a little longer each time to hear a bit of Maggie's gentle wisdom. When the end came, it was as natural as the changing of the seasons. Maggie slipped away one blue-white morning. Charlie curled up beside her, the last touch of her hand gentle in his fur. Word spread quickly through Blue Hollow. The news was met first with sadness, then with a quiet, determined gratitude. An understanding that Maggie had given the town something rare, something they had only begun to understand. Her funeral was held at the edge of the woods, where Rowan had first entered the world beyond the fence. It was a bright, cold day, sunlight filtering through bare branches as neighbors, children, wildlife officers, and the teacher who had helped tell Rowan's story all gathered. Charlie sat beside Maggie's empty chair, dignified and still, as if holding vigil for the spirit that had meant so much to him and to everyone there. People took turns sharing memories. Mrs. Ellis spoke first, her voice steady. Maggie taught us that kindness isn't just for people, it's for all living things. She made us see that compassion can change more than a single life. It can ripple out and change a whole town. The wildlife officers recalled the debates and doubts, but also the respect Maggie had won through her commitment. She showed us what it really means to be a guardian, the elder officer said. She loved Rowan enough to let him go, and loved Blue Hollow enough to trust us with her story. Children placed stones and wildflowers around Maggie's chair, whispering their own goodbyes. Some left folded notes, drawings, or even a tuft of golden dog hair from Charlie. The trail by her cabin was renamed Kinship Path, and the town decided unanimously to protect the wild land surrounding it for future generations. As the service ended, a hush fell over the crowd. People glanced toward the tree line, as if expecting something. Then, out on a distant ridge, a golden form appeared. Rowan, wild and whole, watching the gathering in silence. His coat caught the sunlight, his stance regal, eyes taking in the scene below. The children gasped, pointing in awe. For a moment, Rowan lingered, as if saying his own goodbye. Then, with a flick of his tail, he slipped back into the forest, becoming a legend before their eyes. The weeks that followed brought new changes. Children learned Rowan's story at school, studying the importance of wildlife, empathy, and the way one person's courage could shift the heart of a community. Neighbors who had once grumbled about Maggie's choices now found themselves picking up litter along Kinship Path, or quietly leaving food for stray animals. Mrs. Ellis's students started a wild kinship project, planting native flowers along the trails, each new blossom a living tribute to the woman who taught them how to care. Charlie, though slowing with age, became a gentle fixture in the neighborhood, greeting children and visitors along the trail. People swore they sometimes saw Rowan watching from the shadows, a silent guardian of the path he had once shared with Maggie. But the greatest legacy was harder to see, an invisible thread that ran through every heart touched by Maggie's story. Blue Hollow changed because Maggie had dared to act on compassion, to risk her own heart for something wild, and to trust that real love would never demand possession. The lesson was simple but profound. Guardianship is an act of humility, a willingness to risk heartbreak for the sake of something greater than yourself. On the first anniversary of Maggie's passing, the whole town gathered at Kinship Path. Children placed stones and flowers on the trail. Adults shared stories, and Mrs. Ellis read from Maggie's journal. She spoke the lesson that Maggie had lived. The wild hearts we free will always find a way back, sometimes in body, always in spirit, to those who dared to love them. That night, as the stars scattered across the sky, Blue Hollow felt both larger and more intimate, as if every tree, every creature, every person carried a piece of Maggie's hope. Rowan's legend grew. Some claimed to hear his cry on moonlit nights. Others said he left paw prints near the cabin or was glimpsed crossing Kinship Path at dawn. Whether true or not, his presence was a comfort, a promise that the wild would always remember the hands that dared to care. Maggie's cabin remained, its porch sagging gently, a wreath of wildflowers always hanging by the door. Visitors left small tokens, stones, feathers, a scrap of flannel, a note of thanks. And in every act of kindness, every risk taken for the sake of something wild and free, Maggie's legacy lived on. Blue Hollow was never quite the same. Its people walked a little softer, listened a little closer, and greeted the unknown with open hands instead of closed hearts. And so the wild kinship Maggie West had nurtured grew, season after season, its roots deep, its branches wide. A reminder that true love is the courage to let go, and true kinship is the gift of giving others the freedom to return, in their own way, when the time is right. If Maggie's story moved you, let it move you to action. Welcome wildness into your heart. Protect what you love, and be brave enough to let go when the time comes. In every act of true kinship, you plant hope for a wilder, more compassionate world.